Well, hello and welcome to the stream. Let's go ahead and see what we can get into. We're going to do a little bit of vintage art bell. This is our early show.
As I broached the subject of enlisting in the service, my parents probably breathed a big sigh of relief as they were beginning to run out of ideas on how to deal with the black sheep of the family. And since their marriage was on very thin ice at that point, they did not need additional problems from me. Accordingly, even though I was still only 17 at the time, they signed the necessary consent form, and I was officially enlisted in the Air Force and off to see the world. Now, when I was 17, I got out of high school. I enlisted in the armed services. This was in 1962, and the Vietnam fiasco was at its early stage. At any rate, at that time, I just decided more or less arbitrarily the Air Force sounded like a good part of the armed services to enter. I certainly did want to enlist in the Marines, like my parents had done earlier. I knew better in the Marines. Of course, the first part of my experience with the Air Force was 8 weeks of excruciating basic training, commonly referred to as boot camp or living hell. My boot camp training was at Lackland Air Force Base. Oh, it was both physically and mentally demanding. They put you under tremendous pressure. They call you names. They degrade you in front of everybody. You work out physically like you cannot imagine. It was torture. It was hell. Their aim, of course, was to weed out the weak from those who would endure. The approach taken weak people out is smart. They didn't want the weaklings, and they shouldn't have them. And for all, you want the toughest people you can get for our country. I remember each night when I returned to my bunk in the barracks, I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. I'd lie there and say, what the hell have I done? I wondered whether I lost my mind. It was as though when I was home, I was in the frying pan. Now in the Air Force, I was in the fire. Nevertheless, I stayed for about 8 miserable weeks of it. And after all that was done, they assigned me to become a medic. To become a medic, I was first sent to Greenville Air Force Base in Greenville, Mississippi. This was followed by Gunter Air Force Base in Alabama. Finally, I was sent to Amarillo Air Force Base in Texas. I stayed for a period of 18 months at the hospital at Amarillo Air Force Base there in Texas. It turned out to be a very, very eventful 18 months. Being trained as a medic and engaging in medicine, as I did in the armed forces, I must say, it was something I very much enjoyed. Of course, I was in constant close contact with doctors. I became familiar with them on a very personal basis. And military doctors, I discovered, have a very perverted sense of humor. Matter of fact, this may well be true of all doctors. I don't know. At any rate, one day, an unnamed woman that I knew at the time found a lump under my left shoulder blade, naturally. So I went to the hospital to have one of my doctor friends take a look-see. He poked around and exclaimed, "Oh yes, we have something here. And we're just going to have to do a little bit of outpatient type surgery and pop this sucker out." Well, he went on to explain that it probably was nothing more than a fatty little tumor which could be easily dealt with. They decided, therefore, that it was not a major deal. And so there was no need to put me under general anesthetic. All they needed to do was inject a couple of shots of xylocaine, a local anesthetic, to numb the area. So they took me into the operating room, where they had me lay down on my stomach to inject a couple of shots of xylocaine and get to work. Well, as they began to explore this thing they had discovered, they found out it was not exactly a little tumor, but something that extended deeply into my chest cavity. Unfortunately, once they had me opened up, they could not put me under general anesthetic to continue with the operation for some mysterious medical reason or another. Their only alternative was to pump in more xylocaine, and they did that. They injected 30 more shots of xylocaine into me, and believe it or not, I still felt them cutting and snipping in there. It was awful. By this time, several doctors were working on me, and this dragged on for several hours. Eventually, they clipped and snipped the damn tumor out. Well, I'll tell you, those were the days when they did not have the facilities to test the tumor right there. They had to send a sample off to a lab elsewhere to find out if the thing was benign or malignant. If the results revealed the tumor was malignant, that would mean I still had something to worry about. Anyway, they took out as much as they could and closed me up, and I had to sit and wait for the results. It was about 4 days later. The doctor I knew called me into his office for the results. I came in, sat down, stared at the doctor, who looked at me with a very stern, concerned expression, and he said, "Art, I'm going to have to tell you this. I'm sorry I have to tell you this, but you only have about 6 months." Now, when I heard this, I did what anybody else would do. My stomach turned inside out. My heart began to race. My face drained of all of its color, and I broke into a cold sweat. At that moment, the doctor couldn't contain himself any longer. He began cracking up, laughing his ass off. Here was a man, a captain of rank, and right in front of me, he fell on the floor, laughing, until I thought he'd slip. Well, I guess this must have been the funniest thing he ever done in his whole life, he thought. I, on the other hand, couldn't share the mirth. I sat sullenly by, eventually clasping my head in my hands and began to cry. It was about this time that this acid doctor picked himself up on before I realized that what he'd done was perhaps not so funny to me. The tumor they had actually taken out was an unusually large, fatty, benign tumor. I was okay. I must say, however, this was probably one of the scariest things in my life. The other interesting story about my experience at Amarillo Air Force Base is the occasion when I got involved in establishing a legal radio station with it. It was during my stint with the Armed Services that I inadvertently began my radio career. I was stationed at Amarillo Air Force Base at the time. One day I was bored. I was using my handset, which had been my passion for many years, right up until I enlisted in the Air Force just for help. I began poking around space to see what I could find. I eventually got the EPS variable frequency oscillator holding in VFO. The EPS VFO was used essentially to fly my ham radio airsphere. With my knowledge and skill in electronics, I converted this VFO to operate on the AM radio band. And in my parents' room, I figured out a way to put music on the VFO modulated and managed to transmit to the parents located around the base just for fun. I began transmitting music to the guys in Paris. Most of them loved it. They tuned in the radio every night for quite some time and got music without commercial interruption. Eventually, our first sergeant found out about it, and he talked to the commanding officer. Well, the commanding officer decided that he did not want to have us have our own little radio station in Paris. By this time, I met Big Whitley, who became involved with my little enterprise, as well as another good friend, Lynn. All were very much involved, and the commanding officer called us in to consult about the radio station and said, "Wait, guys up." Well, we said we thought it'd be okay to play music for the guys on base. So we made a transmitter, a radio transmitter. I responded somewhat eagerly. The commanding officer pondered all this for a moment. And their attention. "You know, guys," he said, "you really should be doing this in balance." He said, "Tom, really, well, it was you who called military amateur radio station commander of base and see if they might be going to keep it but usually about that." Well, as we respond during this, our little eyes, well, we got all excited because we had no idea what he was doing, but it's what he was doing. I couldn't believe it. I thought sure about getting president, maybe end up doing coils for the next week. And I was planning on for all the way to us to begin our own state. He just wanted to have friends. You know, that way in the military sometimes get away from me. Well, I don't think it's okay. Anyway, we were all surprised and elated. We all said, "Yeah, let's do it." And so we did. Neither the commanding officer nor anybody else for that matter had any concept of commercial broadcasting. What was legal, what was not legal. They just wanted to get it handled. That's the military point. So, with his commanding officer's blessings, we managed to close an entirely illegal pilot radio station at the military amateur radio service building. In hindsight, this was obviously meant to be for me. It was the beginning of my radio career. Although I began outside the law with an illegal radio station. In the 2 rooms allocated to us, we built a complete studio, which was battery surveys, a board to control everything, a microphone, the makers, all the other usual studio traffic. I decided first to get a higher powered radio transmitter and convert this whole thing to a broadcast band. We also erected for ourselves a huge antenna, 300 feet long. Then we went on the air. When we first went on the air, you could only hear comparison actually all over Amarillo Air Force Base, where we were again. Everybody loved our radio station, which we called Amarillo AMPD, or Space Jet for the medical squad. We had a marvelous time. We had plenty of time. After a while, we discovered the transmitter and the air kind of worked a little too well. We were also picked up about 3 miles away by the city of Amarillo. At that time, the city of Amarillo had about 150,000 people. As we were not only on a daily, but on a 24-hour schedule, and we provided the popular music of the day without commercial interruption, it made it very difficult for the legitimate commercial stations to compete with us. But somehow we managed to stay on the air without any hindrance for a full year. To give you some idea of a little bit of what we did, I have gone back, thanks to Lynn Whitley, and managed to resurrect a little bit of actually what aired all those years ago, 30 years ago, however long ago it was, Amarillo Air Force Base. And if you listen very carefully, you'll get a taste of it. It was utter madness, but it was fun. And here's actually a little piece of what I did 30 years ago. Listen to this. Unbelievable. I was KFED, and every once in a while, in the world of radio, they conduct a survey. It's called an Arbitrum survey. Here's how many people are listening to each radio station in given geographic area. Well, the radio stations will then rank for the market data. Unfortunately for us, showed up on the Arbitrum survey in Amarillo. Every commercial station in the city of Amarillo went observed. Not only did they find the stations, but they also found we were watching there with a significant number of their audience. After all, we were playing the same music. And we were just as fun to listen to. But we didn't want a commercial. Naturally, they wanted to get one part to replace the commander of our base. And once again, we found ourselves in his office standing in the session. Besides the in the rear of the store, explained to us we had an illegal radio station on your train, NKMED was history from that point forward. Together, that's when was significant because it was the beginning of my entry into the world of professional broadcasting. My dreams for traveling would be fulfilled by the Air Force in a big way. I was to be transferred to Kadena Air Force Base on the island of Okinawa. Actually, we administered Okinawa at that time. Okinawa is southwest of mainland Japan, about 300 miles east of mainland China. From Texas, the Air Force was basically sending me to the other side of the world. But frankly, I could not have been happier. I was given 30 days leave to prepare. So, I went over to Connecticut. I said goodbye to my family, got on an airplane, and off I went to begin an adventure that probably shaped the rest of my life. I'll never forget when I got off the airplane at Kadena. I went through an amazing, intriguing, life-altering experience. I was young, excited, ready for adventure. It's amazing to think about how it affected me immediately as I entered this new world of the Orient. All my senses were stimulated. Every sight, smell, sound, sense that I realized everything that I was accustomed to in America was here in the Orient. This was not like traveling to Europe. This is altogether different. Right away, I fell in love with the people, the culture, and I began to learn the language. On the base, I did my job as a medic at the hospital there. Every spare moment I had, any moment I could get off the base, I spent my time carousing, learning about the culture, and yes, womanizing. That's when I developed my love for Oriental women. The experience was incredible to me, and I finally just figured a way to move off base altogether. I so wanted to assimilate completely with these people. Off base, I lived as a Japanese person, living with a Japanese girl in a Japanese home. Like the Japanese, I slept on the floor on what are called tatami mats, ate Japanese food, wore their clothes, watched Japanese television, and so on. It was as though I became Japanese. The Air Force, of course, was not completely thrilled about my cohabitating with one of the locals. They felt that I had a barracks room on base, and that's where I had to be. So to offset this, I hired an Okinawan to keep my barracks room clean. He come in and clean, shine my shoes, put them in their proper places under my bed. Even though I was having the most enjoyable time in Okinawa, Vietnam was in full swing. Tragically, there were growing numbers of American casualties because of what was going on in Vietnam. At the outset of the flow of American casualties, the injured were flown from Saigon all the way to the U.S. for treatment non-stop. There were no appropriate medical facilities in Vietnam to treat the injured. Besides, it was probably too dangerous anyhow. But the American press learned of it, creating an instant stir, resulting in political pressure to quickly stop the flow of casualties to the U.S. Needing an alternative, it was decided the casualties would be flown to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Consequently, in an effort to assist doctors dealing with the influx of casualties, there were several times during my time at Kadena Air Force Base that I was temporarily transferred to the hospital at Clark. What I saw at the hospital at Clark Air Base was horrible and tragic. I'll never forget it as long as I live. To this day, I've really actually had a lot of difficulty thinking about it, let alone talking about it. To constantly see people coming back with limbs missing, other part of their bodies destroyed, making it impossible to live normally ever again was very, very difficult for me. But I did the best I could. Not long after my brief stint at Clark Air Base, I was temporarily transferred to Da Nang, Vietnam, to help out with casualties there. Hopefully for lives, but I saw the result of those who were. Again, what I saw was horrible. It is very difficult for me to think upon or write about. My 4 years with the Air Force were up. And even leading up to that day, I really struggled in my mind about what to do. I had difficulty in trying to decide whether or not I wanted to re-enlist in the Air Force and stay on for several more years. But I had really pretty much had my fill of the Air Force. The armed forces are simply too regimented and restricted for me. It was more in my nature to be free and unrestricted. This may seem strange because my life now is very structured and disciplined. It must be. But the vast difference between the structure of the armed forces and my own is just that. It's my structure, my terms, so I don't mind. So I decided to get out of the Air Force. In 1966, I was discharged from the Air Force at March Air Force Base in California. I didn't regret leaving the Air Force, but I did regret leaving the Orient when I was in California. Nonetheless, I resigned myself to my decision at the time and decided to take some time to get my bearings. By about 1975, I reached the point in my experience with the radio when I simply couldn't keep it. I suppose I began to get bored with the rock music state. I was beginning to get tired of the gypsy lifestyle, and I knew I wasn't going to get rich doing it. Or maybe I was just getting too old for this state, and I wanted to change. Before I seriously entered into the world of talk radio, it was one of transitions. I was constantly interested in something more than just an average job. So I spent a lot of my life picking up one job, growing more, finding another, and so forth. As I said, I love electronics. I love technical stuff. I'm intrigued by how things work. I love the challenge of fixing electronic and technical things after 20 years of intellectually non-challenging rock radio. And its inherent gypsy-like existence. I really needed something different, challenging, perhaps more secure. So I took this technical job at Cox Cable in San Diego. 3 years later, I took a technical job at Times Near in Las Vegas. My work at Times Near was actually exciting at first. We had to basically build an entire cable system. And that's the place where all the signals come from scratch. Very exciting. Then I installed the satellite gear, the processing and microwave links, all the other equipment for the cable system. Then after building it, I maintained it. I kept the job for about 5 years. I had an entire department under me. But then I became kind of like a Maytag cameraman, and work set in and overwhelmed me around the time. Did not share my philosophy about work. As far as she was concerned, I should be content with a secure, well-paying job at a big multinational company. Maybe she was just more practical than I am. She wanted me to make good money, have regular hours, dedicate my life to her and our family. But I was not working well. I can't stay with anything very long. If it doesn't excite me, if it doesn't in some way, I want to get to a point in my life where I need some intellectual stimulation, and I needed to do something for which I had a genuine interest or curiosity, someone call that self-interest. Others will, for the rest of their life, do the same 9-to-5 job. Just sitting around collecting a check was not for me. Kim did not understand at all my thinking on that. It was about that time that I was whiling away my life at Times Near. Word got out to the infamous program director of KWN Las Vegas. KWN is a huge, clear channel, 50,000 watt radio station. With its strong signal, KDON has compressive broadcasting. Reaches up to about 150 miles out of Las Vegas. Right? KDON is an altogether different radio station. Radio signals can see being somewhat differently. They can bounce off the ionosphere and they can broadcast a lot farther, particularly when you've got a very strong signal to start with, as is the case with KPWN. At night, their signal went 12 western states. Now, obviously, seriously with this kind of broadcast range. It's got a tremendous opportunity to reach more people than just Las Vegas and the highway in Los Angeles. Apparently, Claire had heard that I had a lot of years of radio under my belt with a certain amount of experience in talk. In essence, KDON found me. I didn't even know they were looking for anybody. Claire Reese was very clever in her approach, inviting me to do some part-time work for KDON. Would you like to work for radio again? At least part-time? It sure used to help, she said. She appealed to my deepest instincts and desires, and I did not and could not resist, sure, said I. And that was that. So one day, they put me in with another talk show host on a Saturday show just to see how I would do. Normally, I do not like working with anybody else. I prefer working alone on the air. Well, for one thing, with two radio hosts, there's a tendency for one to dominate the other. Two begin a argument. I'm not sure as they call it on the line, who's on the air. Both may give the impression of ganging up on the caller and so forth. In this case, I got along very well with this particular host, whose name was Jack Daniels, like the whiskey. To this day, Jack remains one of my dear friends. After this initial show, as my audition, Claire came to me in the studio, somebody pretty well. I was immediately offered a part-time weekend shift as part of a two-man talk show, and I gladly accepted. I must say, I had a great time. Well, alas, that same old black magic of radio put its spell back upon me, and there I was hooked all over again. All the while, I continued to work at times here during the week, working a regular 5-day week. Eventually, I was offered a midday talk show to be aired every week, co-hosting with Jack Daniels from 10 a.m. in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. Well, this meant I had to work 12 hours every day of the regular work week. Turned out to be grueling. Somehow I managed to work like that for about a half a year, but it finally got to the point of physical exhaustion. Just as I was at my physical and mental limits after 6 months of this madness, time senior management came to me and gave me an ultimatum. They said I had to make a choice. I had to choose to go to KDON or to manage the technical department I developed and ran for 5 years. Climb up the corporate ladder and help out all kinds of candy. I told them I'd think about it, and I thought about it. I thought about it until I thought I'd get sick. So I went to Claire Reese. Claire wanted me to work for KWN exclusively. She made me an offer, but unfortunately her offer was about $8,000 less than I was making at Times Meeting. This was a big decision at this point in my life, where I needed a perfectly good, secure, well-paying job for a radio job that paid much less and was not necessarily very secure. After meeting with Claire, I went home to talk to my wife. Now, Kim thought I was absolutely, completely out of my mind. For her, there was no alternative to Times Meeting. Nonetheless, in the end, I went with my first love, radio. So there I was again, back in full-time radio. To start, I continued the show co-hosted with Jack Daniels from 10 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. I also did the necessary production work, including commercials and whatever else needed to be done for several months. After a few months, I began dreaming about doing a show at night. Believe me, I was very aware of how powerful a station KDON was, how widely it was broadcast at night. I wanted to reach more people. But I was ambitious as always, and I wanted to take advantage of the nighttime opportunity, so I told Claire I wanted a chance to do the show at night. She listened carefully. She nodded and said, "Listen." That was that. Claire Reese is one of the more unusual people I've ever known in my whole life. This is a person I would grow to love and hate at the same time. I love her, because I guess she's a mentor of mine. She is at once one of the most professional, intelligent, hard-hitting business people I've ever known. Straight out, Claire Reese is every inch a really great person. She possesses an unbelievable amount of knowledge and experience about business from radio, yet at times Claire Reese is also as mad as happy. And I'm full of that. And she's admitted that to me. Over the course of the years I worked at Kate Hunt, Claire fired me, I don't know, I think about half a dozen times. She probably acknowledged many of the incidences when she fired me, but she probably denied many more of them. I think it's safe to say my relationship with Claire Reese was a love-hate relationship. And I'm sure it's on both sides. I'm sure there were times when Claire Reese hated my guts. But she recognized that I didn't have talent right from the very beginning, and that she loved me. There was a 5-hour show from 1 to 6 a.m. every day, hosted by an older man, and I'll just call him Hank Bradley on his real name. Hank had been in broadcasting for a lot of years, spending many years doing this show, but Hank was beginning to slow down, consider retirement. So there was a chance that eventually, if I hung around long enough, I figured I could get a shot at taking over that show. Hank obviously could care less about the program. Didn't see the potential I saw. He had several lines to receive calls, but he would either neglect callers altogether, or would do the show a long time before he even got the callers, or more likely wouldn't get them at all. Usually on any given night, Hank would sort of sit in front of Mike. He would take out the local newspaper and read the front. He would literally read each article as it appeared in the paper. Sometimes you could actually hear the newspaper pages rustling as he would proceed through it. And if you listened all night long, you would hear before you were done just about every article in the Las Vegas paper. Nothing could be more boring than his no cigars and programs no curtain coffee. Obviously, there had to be change there, and I was going to bet that Claire recognized that. Well, she did. One day I had a break. It turned out to be compensated for what happens. I'm done with the show. Claire came and told me, here's my big chance. Warned me if I did a lousy job, the big hook in broadcasting the show biz would come out. I'd be yanked right out of there. Well, I thanked her profusely. Was very excited at the opportunity to do my own live all-night talk show. So began my first pre-talk show panic attack. I wanted desperately to do a good job. I wanted it to work more than anything. But now before the show, I finally turned down. Breathing became difficult. I began to sweat profusely. I was shaking. I smoked one cig after the other just to survive. And finally, at 1 a.m., it was my turn to go on the air. By this time, I was sick, perspiration, and nervous as hell. I'm certain I sounded very, very nervous and scared on the air. I began the show against my panic attack, but somehow kept going. I think the only thing that had a way of soothing me, encouraging me, was listener response. Mark and Brandon were not only drone on, but frequently never even bothered to solicit listeners to call. You've got to ask people to call, or they don't. And when he did, sometimes he wouldn't get a call for an hour. I made every effort to be well prepared, spent about 4 or 5 hours at it. And so when I went on the air, I just began discussing topics of interest at the time. I was ready for anything. And the moment I invited listeners to call, the phone bank lit up like a Christmas tree. The phones were jammed with callers throughout the night. I had a blast. Claire was pleased. I can't got too excited about anything. 2 weeks passed after my first shot at doing the all-night show, and I had another chance. Again, I was well prepared for the show. I talked about what was of interest at the time, and again, the phone bank lit up like a Christmas tree. Well, that's what did the trick for me, and that's where the change occurred. Claire now knew she had a hit on her hands with me. Hank was shifted to do the day show, and I got to do the night show. That was the beginning of a show called West Coast AM. Now, there are a whole bunch of interesting stories about West Coast AM. from when we first began. For one thing, at that time, KDON was located at the Las Vegas Plaza Hotel, actually now Jackie Dawn's Plaza Hotel. And as part of a trade-off for advertising a hotel on the air, the Plaza provided the toll-free 800 number that was used on the air during my show. For years, when Hank gave out the 800 number on the show, well, frankly, there had also on average, the 800 number phone bill was maybe $100 a month. The Plaza Hotel didn't think anything about paying it. But after I was on the air for 1 month, they got the bill. Only this time, it was for $12,000. Well, the Plaza Hotel management went through the roof. Needless to say, they immediately pulled the 800 number. KDON had to get its own to accommodate all the calls I was getting, and there were plenty of them. So I commuted the 130-mile round trip between Toronto and KDON in Las Vegas. I always carried with me a thermos of coffee. It was back, you'll recall, when thermos bottles were made with glass cans inside and a metallic or plastic sheet outside. One day I was sitting in the studio at about 2 or 3 in the morning, drinking coffee as usual. After drinking about half of the coffee, I looked in my cup. I had dropped my thermos bottle earlier and hadn't bothered to check it. So I looked into my cup, and there, floating around in my coffee, was what seemed to be a million pieces of ground glass. I reached over and I shook the thermos bottle, and then I could hear it. I could hear all the glass bouncing around. Well, in my mind, I suddenly figured out, I was on the air. I figured out I had been drinking ground glass for the last 2 hours, and right on the air. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been drinking ground glass for the last 2 hours, I said. People began calling me and saying, quick, get off the air, get to a hospital. We had emergency medical team showing up at the Plaza Hotel. It was awful. I refused to leave. People were calling me and advising me about what to do. One guy called up and said, I said, save your life, Art. You need to immediately eat a half loaf of bread. At least a half loaf. I guess the assumption was the bread would go into my stomach, absorb the broken glass, and pass harmlessly through my system. Well, I was ready to do anything. Someone ran up to the radio station, left a loaf of bread outside the door. I ran out during a commercial, got it, ran back into the studio, and ran 3 consecutive minutes of commercials. In 3 minutes, I actually downed an entire half loaf of bread. It was the ugliest thing you ever saw. I was stuffing pieces of bread into my mouth a mile a minute. I came back out here, loaded with coffee, and now the bread is standing in my belly, and I have the worst belly ache I ever had in my whole life. Even thought I was dying. I stayed on the air until the bitter end. People were telling me it was the end. They were calling up and saying goodbye. It was really pathetic. And I'm sure a lot of you long-time listeners may remember that. Anyway, after I got off the air, I looked very carefully and found that yes, the thermos bottle had indeed broken. However, the glass had stayed inside the area between the glass and the outside of the container. What I was actually drinking were little pink chips that had coated the glass. I did the West Coast show for more than a decade. And over the years, the show always ranked #1 on the West Coast as an all-night talk show. I was, and I still am, one of the only very successful radio talk show hosts to do on-screen live talk radio. I don't screen calls I receive. Now, that means I never know what's coming up next. I just press the next button like somebody goes on the air. That's part of my philosophy, trying to do it this way. I take a risk doing it, but it makes it interesting, spontaneous. I handle everything as it comes along. Usually, I don't even limit the topic of discussion. Somebody calls and wants to talk about a particular topic, that's what we do. I've made it my policy that something useful can be derived from just about any craft. And unlike some talk show hosts, I don't need to talk only to people who happen to agree with me on something. Everybody is welcome to come. I know myself, if I didn't operate this way, I'd get bored. And I never would have stayed with it as long as I have. Now, despite all the success that West Coast AM was having, Claire still found reasons to fire me many times. The last most memorable example was after I had just flown to Paris. I went to France on the Concorde and returned from that trip, only not on the Concorde. It took 15 hours. And so I got home dog tired. And I called Claire up and said, Claire, I'm terrible with jet lag. She wanted me to come in that night. I said, no, Claire, I can't do it. I need one day. She said, okay, well then just don't bother coming in at all. She hung the phone up in my ear. She wasn't joking. She was quite earnest when she said this. 3 hours later, she called back and said, all right, you're not fired. Skip tonight, come in tomorrow. And either I'll find someone for the night or I'll shut the station down altogether. She would always say that. Actually, her exact words were, I'll shut the son of a bitch off. And she occasionally did. She was often known and dramatic frequently threatened to shut down the station. It was, of course, ridiculous, but she would do it. No, finally I said, I'll come in. So I went. Claire reached for a scream. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the day to her voice screaming on my answering machine. She'd yell and scream about something I'd done or thought that I had done. She had a personality that could piss off people. She had a taskmaster way about her. She'd sit at her desk, look over her glasses, breathe her nose, and give me the coolest look you've ever seen in your whole life. Usually, the look was delivered along with a tirade of words that would make a sailor blush. There had been occasions when I'd sit in her office and she'd use every name in the book to address me. She'd scream, yell, I'd quiver and be appropriately scared and frightened. Eventually, after enough years of it, I began to realize that I didn't have to take this kind of treatment. It was a way of, it's a very old way of managing by intimidation. And so I began yelling back. This in turn resulted in a number of pitched, screaming, and yelling battles. I matched decibel for decibel and word for word. This in turn resulted in my being fired, even more times. Claire Reese does not like being corrected or challenged in any way. She's a pointed ruler. Just don't do that sort of thing, but I did it. Oddly enough, she respected my talent, and I respected her leadership. One day, long after West Coast AM had proven itself a popular show, I went into her office and explained that I desperately needed a raise. He said until then I was going along, just sort of eking out of it as best I could on the salary. But it wasn't enough. I was aware that despite the popularity of the show didn't make a lot of money. For some reason, the sales department of KDON didn't even try to sell the show. As far as I was concerned, West Coast AM was definitely a marketable commodity. And as a matter of fact, prime for syndication. Anyway, when Claire was on the strike and the raise that I not only thought I deserved, but desperately needed. She said, no, can't do it. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe it. Well, if you can't do it, I said, steadily trying to maintain my composure, I can't continue. Fine, she said, then go. In this instance, I quit. And she fired me at about the same time. In a sense, we were at yet another standoff. This is a very famous time in my experience with KWN, and many of my long listeners will recall. They will remember when I did not come on the air. And some may even remember how long I could take on, which I believe was about 4 months. This was a long time. The crazy thing about it is, I ended up working for another radio station in Las Vegas for much more money. Didn't even do a show. I engineered. In fact, I stayed on the air during that 4 months at IS. and engineer. In the meantime, Claire Reese kept West Coast AM on the air, but she used a couple of public observations in an attempt to make it work well. Unfortunately for her, my replacements couldn't do the kind of job I did. I would say they failed miserably. And for the entire period I was away, Kate on constantly got calls from listeners asking about my whereabouts, where I'd go, they wanted to know. I'm happy to say the show was awful. I'm certain Claire Reese knew it. No doubt her pride prevented her from asking me to come back. I tried to hold out as long as I could, but eventually I gave in. The engineering stuff wore on me. I do it easily, but it bores me. So I tried calling Claire to ask her for my job back. She ignored my calls, wouldn't take them. After a few days, I called her and finally she answered. When I asked for my job back, she replied and let me have it. Her pride was just too great. I'd not be put off, so I kept calling her. Every time she got back on the phone, I told her, I want to get back. I want to get back on. I know I made a mistake. I groveled. I wanted to get back on. No, she would say. I continued to call her every day. Would she ever admit she made a mistake? So I swallowed my pride and told her I made a mistake. It's true. I gave her an ultimatum, and I should never have done it. She doesn't like ultimatums. Never responds favorably to them, and I knew it. I explained to her I never should have left. I go home. Finally, she called me and said, all right, damn it. Come back. And so that I came. I continued doing the show West Coast AM. This time I did the show 6 nights a week. That was a total of 30 air hours a week. I kept it up for the next 2 or 3 years, very successfully achieving the highest ratings and so forth and so on. Phone lines every time every night show was as popular as it could be. Now, I lived in Florida, which meant I had to drive 65 miles to Las Vegas for life, and the same amount back home, 6 days a week. Now, all this airtime, all the driving, was a little much. I realized I couldn't go on indefinitely and have me survive. So again, there I am, standing before Claire Reese. I said, I can't operate like this anymore. I need the airtime back 5 days a week. I said, really, I need a bit of my life back. Somehow I managed to avoid getting fired over this and was actually able to cut back to a 5-day week. It was still a lot of community. Nonetheless, eventually I did manage to get fired again despite my success. This time not by Claire, but by the elderly, eccentric, lovable millionaire who still owns the station. We'll call him Bob Blanche. I believe he's well into his 80s now. In those days, Mr. Blanche owned a number of radio and TV stations. Anyway, he just happened to drop by Kate on one day and called me into his office. Mark, he said, I've decided that we need to cancel the news. I looked at him for 5 minutes at the top of every hour. Remember, I do 5 hours now. We have the Associated Press News. No one cancels the news. It's part of what you do. I mean, it generates the interest that you do in the show. It keeps you up on current events. Besides, frankly, a person who runs a 5-hour talk show needs about 5 minutes to be able to run and take care of business. So I said, sir, you cannot drop the news. And I said respectfully, yes, I can. He responded, but wait a minute, I said, Freddie, I'm going to go to the men's room. And the only time I can do that is during the news at the top of the hour. You can't cancel the news. Yes, I can, he said. I own this station. And if I want to drop the news, it's going to be dropped. And so I sat there, all dejected, and finally said, well, if you cancel the news, then you'll have to fire me. Okay, he said, then you're fired. Okay, I said, and he began to walk out the door. He said, wait a minute, okay, you're not fired. In the end, he listened to music, and we didn't cancel the news. But it was an awfully strange encounter with this man, who I hardly ever saw. Yet he was behind my success and was literally the one who fed me. Overall, my experience in Takeoff was rocky. lovable time that I'll never forget. Moreover, it really is where I got my big start in talk radio. And that I'll always be indebted to the people at Cato, especially Claire Reese. Sometimes, as I reflect on my experience at Cato, I compare it to my experience at boot camp when I enlisted in the Air Force Veterans Fund. Claire Reese was the get-in-your-face kind of drill sergeant who drilled and pounded into me what I needed to know for my career. Just get up and get covered basic training because I learned more than just the basics to succeed. One good example of what I learned from Claire Reese was that I should always err on the side of caution, and I should avoid putting something on here which could get me sued or get the station sued. This was very good advice, especially these days. We are, after all, very a litigated society. For this advice and direction, advice and direction, I really owe Claire a lot. You may feel what I have said here is not true or is too critical, but it is true. I only related the facts as they are from my perspective. At any rate, I respect Claire Reese immensely, no matter what she has done to me, past or does in the future. And as a matter of fact, I predicted in my written book, and I now will tell you that prophecy has been fulfilled because I no longer have to represent as an affiliate. After we left and began the syndication, I asked Cato to carry the whole show. And again, stubborn pride prevented them from doing that. They wouldn't carry any more than about 3 hours. And we tried for about a year and finally moved to KEEG 840 in Las Vegas. And thankfully, they carried the entire program beginning to end. But my prophetic statement in the book turned out to be true.
Currently number 1 on top of log in case sound survey 6 minutes before 10 o'clock in the evening. Your host, of course, Mark Bell. Welcome into the show. Kind of, officially, you were. 74 degrees outside, ridiculously warm for this particular time of year. Right now, on the Golden Island, should be rather cool. As a matter of fact, it should be downright cold at this time. You know, we're just about the end of February, right? When you get it hot, reasonable at all. left. At the top. Age 28, he was one of the youngest Boeing 707 captains to fly in commercial airline service. They were learned about Senate Captain. The son of William Captain Sr., designer of the leadership executive aircraft, truck stereo, and founder of Lear Incorporated. Now Lear Sigma Corporation, a large defense contractor. Extensively on their plans on their subjects. And was known correspondent for combat industry. Between 1975 and 77, while stationed in Europe, William would have conquered Iran. Although William's father was outspoken in his belief of the existence of extraterrestrial visitors. The great concern that on the level of education was William's senior was head of a large defense company. Finally became interested in the subject himself 7 years ago. After dying of headquarters power in the station at Headquarters Air Force Base in London, England. Where three small areas photographed by the Air Force, walking up to one Commander General Gordon Williams. Williams' extensive worldwide civilian, military, and intelligence contacts made it easier for him to penetrate the secrecy surrounding the subject of UFOs. And in 1980, John became acquainted with a government scientist who worked at Elliott Test Shore, part of the super secret Area 51 at the test site. The scientist was a member of the most classified government research team then in existence. It was laid out in research that tried to implicate the propulsion system of 9 Boeing aircraft in storage at the test site. The president was Charles Carver and University, and one settlement was for his first during the worldwide travels and campaigns of the American companies locally out of Greenville, California for 2 years. He is a president of the General Board and General Coaster Malone, so the Fortress House of the American and member of the Special Operations Society. Is chief pilot for Cargo Airlines, flies Boeing 737s throughout the Caribbean and South America. The air has 4 hours, lives in Las Vegas, with his own company. Former actress and puppet star Jacqueline 15. The following program is made possible by a grant from the Bureau of Information. Welcome to Area 2000. This program introduces our listeners to the scientific approach and discussion of 2 particular subjects: UFOs and near-death and after-death experiences. Contact the Bureau of Information 911. Call Angela Wilson between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Area code 702-456-1606. That's Angela Wilson. Area code 702-456-1606. And now, welcome to another Area 2000. I'm Mark Hill. And the people who've got a big plane to fly. We've done our women girls join now. And they're in Philadelphia, it's not the airport, but now he's driving back home. With their glimpses of other realities. And then it'll be Dr. Michael P. Seward, and this one of his major subject, I guess, is going to be UFOs, but his education, his interest goes into the parasciences as well. So we're going to be just moving all over the place this morning. We don't get that. Maybe in some 400 years. Let's find out what's new about the UFO. A program dedicated to an examination of areas of the human experience not easily or deeply in the box. You'll see a deep objective, awakening for the mind as yet not. And yet sense entry is real as the air we breathe, but don't see. This is Dreamland. This indeed is something and Dreamland unbelievable. Everybody have our bell. Great to be here on the Sunday evening, as you know. One of my favorite areas to investigate for our project. A little bit of a difference this evening.